And with that, we're going to go ahead and move into our next session. So I'm not sure, Jeremy or Bree, I'm not sure which one of you is going to be sharing your screen, but feel free to go ahead and do that now while I read your introduction. But next up on our schedule, we have From Cleanup to Ingestion, Migration of Indiana University Archives Accessions. Your presenters are Jeremy Floyd and Bree McLaughlin from Indiana University. Migrating data from outdated software is never simple. Indiana University's ArchivesSpace instance is home to 30 repositories across 7 campuses. We migrated 3,000 plus finding aids from all repositories in 2020. Indiana University exclusively used EAD for finding aid creation, which at least gave a uniform format to import into ArchivesSpace. Accession records, however, are an entirely different situation. Most Indiana University repositories use different unrelated methods of accession creation. Many of the repositories have their own custom spreadsheet or Word document template. However, University Archives at Indiana University Bloomington has been using AskSam for over 30 years to create and manage accession records. AskSam was a free-form application adopted in the 1990s. While the application was ahead of its time 30 years ago, it no longer met their needs. The last version was released 15 years ago, meaning collections managers have been using an application without support for almost as long. After implementing ArchivesSpace for finding aids, collection managers at Indiana University were very interested in the Accessions module as well. As can be imagined, migrating content from an application that hasn't been updated in 15 years wasn't as simple as exporting and importing into ArchivesSpace. This presentation will cover the process of migrating 7,000 plus accession records from AskSam into ArchivesSpace using the bulk accession importer and supplemental API calls. Jeremy and Bree will discuss the lessons they've learned during this process, including the significant amount of data cleanup that was required for a successful migration. And with that, I'll hand things over to Jeremy and Bree.
Right. Thank you so much. You can hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Fantastic.
All right.
So I'm going to be speaking first. So the way the project broke down, I was exporting and cleaning up data and then handing off to Bree to work on ingesting. And we were communicating this whole time and with another colleague, Adam, to get these accession records in. But roughly the presentation will be divided that way. So AskSam is a utility that I had not encountered outside of Indiana University Archives. And I suspect that not many other people have seen it before used in archives, but hopefully our data, legacy data, will be somewhat similar to legacy data other people have encountered. So AskSam was actually a product that was developed as a personal information manager in the 1990s, and it was built to be for building simple databases that were text searchable and free text based. And so in working with that data to migrate it, I had to remind myself that it really was a revolution in the 1990s, from paper-based accession records. Suddenly, archive staff could do a keyword search of their accessions data. Unfortunately, it's that free text ability is somewhat more limited compared to ArchivesSpace, and so there's a lot of data manipulation that had to happen. Fortunately, AskSam was built on an architecture that made exporting quite flexible. You could read any or all fields into a structured CSV format. Unfortunately, this export depended on reading the data between square brackets from the fields. If in the course of creating or modifying accession records, square brackets were utilized within the text of the field or eliminated from the end of the field, a couple of things would happen. If there was no ending bracket, that would read all of the data from the adjacent field into that field upon export, which was an annoyance, but not too much of a problem because at least I could trim out that extra data from the adjacent field out in a regular way. A bigger problem was if an ending square bracket was present in the content of a field. For example, pasted in from an inventory created elsewhere. Anything following that ending square bracket would be skipped entirely from the export. So my first step was a series of exports out of AskSam and looking for fields that utilize square brackets in some way within the field to then go back into AskSam and add or eliminate those missing square brackets. Once I was relatively certain that I had gotten the data entirely out of AskSam, I exported and brought this into OpenRefine to begin to explore the data and begin to understand how accessions were created and used over the course of 30 years of use. Additionally, the data was structured to have accession numbers that spanned within a single record. So most of the accessions had only a single number, but some had an accession start and an accession end. So spanning, and that data needed to be duplicated and assigned to unique IDs, resulting in many more accession records in ArchivesSpace than existed in AskSam. So we started with a little more than 5,000 records in AskSam, and then in the end, we ended up with 7,000 records in ArchivesSpace. The next step was to begin to develop a crosswalk between the fields present in AskSam and the fields present in ArchivesSpace. For the most part, this existed in a one-to-one ratio. And I could simply assign the data from one field directly to another field. There were a few fields like the provenance note that had to be built out of several different fields in AskSam, and that was not too problematic once I understood the structure there. And then there were a few instances where the data in AskSam actually needed to be split amongst a couple of fields. The best example of that was that access for use and access for restriction access and use restrictions were declared in a single field called restriction in AskSam. The content of those notes had to be reviewed manually and parsed out into the appropriate field. And finally, there was some instances where data was partially present within a field, and I had to strip out. For example, accession dates were sometimes present within a field that contained other data. So looking for the forms of dates in the field. This is only a partial crosswalk that gives you an idea of the process that we went through to put things together. Next, so all of the fields in AskSam were just simply free text fields, whether they were date fields or name fields or note fields. That all existed as string information. So I had to begin to normalize the data, particularly data that was going into a more structured form in ArchivesSpace, such as dates. So identifying where dates were and begin to strip them out and then build computer readable dates and data expressions from them. And then probably the most time consuming of the data normalization were in the creator names. So there were a little more than 5,000 names present. No, I'm sorry, 2,500 names present, both corporate and personal names, and beginning to look for local names or authorized names or building local names for them as appropriate. So I used OpenRefine again to begin to group name variations and then systematically went through those names to express them in their authorized forms. Where there was no name authority that I could identify, I used RDA rules to create consistent local names. So in total, 2,563 names were present. About half of those ended up being local names, and then the other half of being authorized names. Also in our accession data, there were some accessions that had no agents to be linked to them, but then for a more limited number, up to 7 agents were linked as creators to the accession. Which leads me to our next step. So we knew that the accession information could be brought in a couple of different ways. The easiest was to do a spreadsheet ingest, and that nicely accommodated most of the information present in the accession information. However, for example, agents, the spreadsheet ingest could accommodate a single creator, but the situation where we had multiple creators could not be accommodated there. And then the related accession, relating to other accessions and relating to the resources, those relations would need to be built through an API. So we kind of have a split approach to that. After doing that cleanup work, I handed off to Bree a very big spreadsheet of information, and she began to try to take that and ingest into ArchivesSpace. So I'll kind of hand over at this point to Bree to talk about that experience.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to reiterate a little bit about what we heard in the abstract, but before this whole accession migration was even a thought, I helped facilitate the migration of over 3,000 finding aids back in 2020. During that process, we had graduate employees focused on creating scripts to transform our finding aid data to be ingestible by ArchivesSpace. We also had multiple full-time faculty and staff members dedicating the majority of their time to migrating finding aids. This situation was different, and it was our first go at migrating accession records. Most of our resources right now are tied up in other projects. So Jeremy, our ArchivesSpace product owner, Adam, and I had to create a plan that was achievable by just the 3 of us. It's also worth noting that we upgraded from ArchivesSpace 2.7.1 to 3.3.1 a week before this migration. And shortly after, our product owner, Adam, left on parental leave. So mistakes were bound to happen, and that's fine. But it's definitely true that my part of this presentation isn't going to be a tutorial by a long shot. I made some errors and encountered speed bumps that some of you can hopefully learn from, just as I have. But to back up a bit, Jeremy sent me the parsed AskSam records, and I started testing imports to see what would and would not import to ArchivesSpace. And as Jeremy mentioned, the accession records, which already had a lot of associated agent records, we couldn't import more than 1 agent from all of those accession records. And Adam will be linking all of the agents, related resources, and related accession records via the API. But since he's on parental leave, that has been delayed for a time, and of all the reasons to delay that, I think that's a pretty great one. But that will be delayed for probably at least another 2 or 3 weeks, but it is coming. Next slide, please. So as you heard, Jeremy did most of the heavy lifting with this accessions migration. Crosswalking AskSam data to ArchivesSpace took by far the most time of this project. My job was to take the data Jeremy cleaned up and import it into ArchivesSpace. I learned a few things right off the bat. The first being that I had to be careful about file types. I figured it would be enough to have a CSV file, but when I imported a CSV file with a handful of accession records, I got this error. The most important bit was invalid byte sequence in UTF-8. After searching for the language in emails from the ArchivesSpace user group listserv, I saw someone mention that the solution for this error was to save your file as a CSV UTF, not just a CSV. So I saved a copy of the file as a CSV UTF, and it imported just fine. I started with relatively small batches of accession records, beginning with a handful, then up to about 100. And the earliest accession records were from 1998. And as you can expect, there was a wide variety of description from then until now. However, I accidentally eluded a lot of that variety by testing just the first 100 accession records as my first real import test. It went without a hitch within all of 10 seconds. So I figured we were good to go. So I hunkered down one evening to import the remaining 7,000 plus accession records. And I quickly learned that there were a lot of import errors to sift through that I hadn't encountered in testing. Most, if not all of them, resulted from how data transformed when converted from an Excel file to CSV. Next slide, please. What took up the most time for me was date formatting. I encountered many invalid date errors particularly the beginning and end date. The accession date seemed to be pretty flexible. They were mostly formatted as month/date/year. The begin and end date, however, gave me a lot of problems. I discovered that I could only successfully import these dates using year-month-date, year-month, or just year. If I used slashes instead of dashes, I got this invalid date error. I thought it would be simple enough. I could just apply the same date formatting to the whole column. However, I got mixed results. Next slide, please. Here's an example of how different dates transformed based on the formatting. I thought selecting year-month-date across the board would give me the results I wanted. However, single dates transformed to a completely different year for reasons I don't exactly understand. And in order to keep single dates the same, they needed to be formatted as general or text. But general or text worked for dates already formatted with dashes, but dates with slashes transformed into 5-digit numbers that I still don't understand. So the end result was me searching for any date with slashes and formatting it to a date with dashes. Again, I didn't run into any of these issues with the Excel file, but I learned that CSV files don't carry over formatting, which is how we had prepared the accession records for import. Next slide, please. Another casualty of lost formatting were our accession numbers. Our accession identifiers had to be formatted as text so they didn't lose the preceding zeros. That was particularly important because the record started with 0000. Once converted to CSV, that was dropped, meaning the clean data needed to be recleaned. And unfortunately, we have so much mixed data that it was difficult to get everything to behave. I also encountered this error about the identifier already being in use. And I'm not positive what happened there because I did cross-reference everything before I was importing, but I have a feeling that it was related to a selection of accession records that had reached the character limit for cells in Excel. Next slide, please. The top image on this slide is an accession record from the original Excel spreadsheet. And the bottom is the same record after I saved the spreadsheet as a CSV UTF. And I actually had this realization while preparing this presentation that this is a result of the character limit in Excel. I learned that the maximum character limit a cell can hold is 32,767, where this record broke in half would have been the 32,768th character. This probably won't come up a ton for any of you, and thankfully we only had 30 of these instances. Next slide, please. When I ran into issues like broken in half accession records or errors that I didn't have the information to fix right away, I copied the record and put it in a spreadsheet full of problem accession records. Since we were migrating over 7,000 records, I wanted to import what I could as efficiently as possible and then deal with the problems next. You'll see in this spreadsheet some of the issues I came across, such as an accession number that was rejected because it was literally 000 ? And the majority of the problem records just needed extent information. There were about 750 problem records and over 700 just needed extent information. Extents were conditionally required for a lot of our records because there was data in the container summary field. And actually what the data that was in the container summary field was the extent data. So Jeremy handled deriving extent data from the container summaries, and then I manually handled the other records. Next slide, please. So I learned a lot of lessons during this migration, to say the least. The first is to test a variety of records to sort out all of the kinks before starting a migration. We were able to avoid many issues with the testing that I did, but I didn't test enough different records to anticipate some very time-consuming issues. Speaking of time-consuming issues, I also learned to check text and number formatting when using a CSV importer. If there was one hard lesson I learned, it would be that one. Next, it was extremely helpful for me to import accession records in batches. I had 7 batches plus an 8th with just rectified problem records. I mainly did this to avoid crashing our server, but it also helped me narrow in on records that prevented successful imports. Another long-term lesson I've learned is to keep migration documentation so I know how to transform data to be ingestible by ArchivesSpace. This won't be our last migration, so it's important that I don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Lastly, and I doubt this is a surprise to any of you, but migrations won't happen quickly. So don't be like me and be overconfident that you can import over 7,000 records without many speed bumps in an hour or two one evening. All things considered, I don't think it went too badly. Beyond one very frustrating evening. And I feel much more confident about future migrations. These records account for just one of the 30 repositories using our ArchivesSpace instance, so there will definitely be more migrations in the future. Next slide, please. And with that, thank you for listening, and I would welcome any questions that you might have.
All right. Thanks so much to Jeremy and Bree. Yeah, we'll see if any questions pop up in the Q&A. Right now, we don't have any. I'm speaking very slowly in case anyone is typing a question. And while we're waiting on that, I'll go ahead and say, yeah, thank you so much to Jeremy and Bree for sharing this with us. A lot of good lessons learned there that hopefully people can take note of and maybe not make the same mistakes. If the worst was one frustrating evening, maybe that's not so bad. Melanie asked, are you able to share your documentation of this process?
I am happy to once it's created.
I understand. That would be great.
We're also going through the process of creating documentation for how accessions are created going forward, and yeah, I would be happy to share both of those.
That would be great. And many different ways to share that, obviously, with the community. You can always post it to the listserv or share it to the awesome ArchivesSpace list. But if you'd like, we can also link that documentation with this recording whenever you have it ready. So if you just want to share that, we can get it to the community in a variety of ways. All right. Seeing no other questions, we're going to do what we did in the last session, and we're going to take a quick 7-minute break before we come back for our final session. So we're going to pause here.